Hi, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times, back with us. I guess this might be your third time on this podcast, but
Something like that.
yeah, and it's just great to have you, and you're looking more robust than ever. So great to see you in such great shape, and you're pouring out fantastic articles every few days on the FT. Everybody should subscribe simply to read Martin Wolf, if nothing else. But there's other fabulous writers and fantastic news. But the FT may be the best source of news in the world at this point, I think. I look at it routinely.
I would
Certainly
certainly agree.
international news. The journal is very focused on the U.S., uh, the Times, the newspaper, the print edition is much more general, but the online edition is very U.S. focused and also pretty biased, I think, to the left. And then we've got all these things that are biased to the right. But anyway, Martin, back again, and thanks so much for joining. And let's start right in. We were just saying before we started here that things are a little bit calmer this week, but in general, I think we've seen a kind of a taco Trump always chickens out scenario to some extent in world politics and world economics, but also this international adventurism in Venezuela. Things seem a little bit quieter this week. Give us your sense of, I think we were on together maybe 6 months ago or so. In this period, we've had all kinds of things occur, but maybe not too much has changed fundamentally. But take it away.
It's obviously really difficult to work out the significance of what we're seeing and interpreting it. But I remain of the view, which I've held really, so let's go back for a decade, that the arrival of Donald Trump as the unquestioned leader of the Republican Party, which was, let's face it, a revolutionary moment. Somebody like him had not been close to power, this close to power, and he was then just about to be elected for the first time ever before. And he has cumulatively over this period clearly completely transformed the American right. That is just obvious. And that remains a fundamental fact. And because the United States is the world's most important country and has been, as it were, the bastion and bulwark of democracy, and of the liberal free market, this has had colossal global significance. And that continues, as it were, week by week, month by month. Even when he lost power, he continued to be a dominant figure. And I've traced that in my own writing, both as a columnist and the book I published a couple of years ago called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. So that's, as it were, the background. And I just want to reinforce something there, which is more recent. My colleague, John Byrne Murdoch, who is our data columnist and does wonderful stuff, had a column last Friday in which he tried to compare, it's very difficult to do, but I think he did it meticulously, the current Trump presidency with similar occasions in which, let's be very clear, right-wing authoritarian succeeded in getting elected in a democratic system. And he was trying to compare how much change had these figures made in in a few months, in the sort of period that Donald Trump has done. And he compared what Donald Trump has done with what these leaders, and we're talking about people like Tayyip Recep Erdogan and Viktor Orban, even Vladimir Putin. And the point he made is that this time, unlike the last time, Trump has been transforming America really across the board faster than anyone else. So this is, whatever we think about the last week or two or three, this looks like the fastest shift in a more autocratic direction across the board than anywhere else comparable. And that's consistent with something I've done. I've just written a long chapter. It's now close to 20,000 words on what's happened since I've published my book. As I said, now it's about 3 years ago. And what I've traced out is a transformation across the board. I think that's crucial. Within that, of course, there are dynamic weeks and then there are steps back. There are periods when you think the world is going to be utterly transformed, and then it turns out not to be quite like that. And that's, I think, part of the method. I don't think that changes the direction. But you're right. It's very clear that a few weeks ago, well, a couple of weeks ago, in the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos in January, not so long ago, people thought that, well, the Americans might just be about to invade Greenland, which is a
Yeah.
possession of one of their allies. Now, that would have been, to put it mildly, a dramatic event, but it didn't happen, and it seems for the moment to be off the table. So that looks indeed like a taco event. Trump always chickens out, as my wonderful colleague Robert Armstrong described it many months ago. But that's not the end of the story. As you noted, there are other big events going on. We still don't know what's going to end up happening in Venezuela. There are some very complex conversations going on now between the United States and Iran. Will that be a precursor to an attack on Iran or a precursor to a peace deal? Similar issues arise with Ukraine. We don't know what the next stage is going to be in American policy globally, trade and all the rest of it. So I think we continue to be in an environment in which right now it seems calmer, more reasonable, but that isn't changing the fundamental situation, which is one of, in my view, a profound transformation. And that's what John Byrne Murdoch's column indicates to me in the data he's put together.
So if we, is there a chance that Trump is actually, for all his obnoxiousness, actually, at least on the international side, a force for good? That getting rid of Maduro, claiming you're going to run Venezuela, but not really, because we can't do that. Maybe helping their oil industry somewhat. I don't know whether it's, it could be just stealing the stuff, or it could be sharing the investment returns. But Maduro certainly, and Chavez before him, took that economy down the tubes over like 30 years. And getting rid of this group is a force for good. If we did the same thing in Cuba, I'm not advocating it. I'm just asking. That economy and that country has been an imprisoned island, as Kennedy put it, for decades, 70 years or so, the 60 years. Then we've got Iran. I mean, if Trump can get Iran to engineer a regime change at some level, that would certainly get them out of terrorism and into growth. That would be transformational. If he could engineer in his manner, an agreement in Ukraine with the Russians, even if all of Eastern Europe, Ukraine is handed over to the Russians, but it's done in the context of absolutely clear, maybe U.S. troops on the ground and European troops on the ground, so that there would not be violations. That all would look good, I think, in some net sense. What do you think?
So that's a very interesting question. So I think we have to take them separately. In the case of the Venezuelan
Incursion.
event, the removal of Maduro, I mean, the obvious question is how much does it change for the Venezuelan people? I think you can decapitate a regime, but this is just one person. The regime remains in place. His replacement is a very senior member of the regime. It will continue, as far as I can see, to operate domestically as before. There is a hypothesis that oil production might increase a lot, though what I read indicates that the ability to increase oil production in Venezuela in the short to medium term is very, very limited, and it will be very, very expensive. And the oil companies show very little enthusiasm for this. So it's a question of, does the US government intend to subsidize these investments? All this we don't know at all. But at the moment, I would say the decapitation of this regime in and of itself doesn't change very much. Obviously the intention of the action was not to change the regime. The intention of the action was to do something spectacular with the head of it. And I'm influenced here, and this is something on which I had a very different position a decade or so ago. But when we got rid of Gaddafi from Libya, I really hoped, as many in Europe did, that this would lead to a transformation of Libya. But the truth is, it's ended up in a horrendous civil war, anarchy. And it's very difficult to argue, to put it mildly, that the people of Libya are any better off than they would have been if we'd left Gaddafi. In fact, they're probably worse off. Decapitation of regimes doesn't tell me very much about what the future will hold. As far as Iran is concerned, I think to me, what I'm seeing is that really and truly the administration has neither the intention nor, in fact, the means of replacing the Iranian regime. They're going to do a deal with that regime, which has pretty clearly shown that it's prepared to do whatever it takes to sustain control, and it has all the coercive means to do so. Now, of course, regimes like that can collapse, but they can only collapse, I think, if they split within, and that is not what we're seeing so far. So it looks to me as though what the United States might get out of this is a pacification of the external activities of Iran. But that's already actually happened, largely, in fact, because of the activities of Israel, the successful war. There's a very big argument about whether, and I don't have the expertise, whether the US intervention in the Iran war by attacking their nuclear program actually made any difference. There's a lot of argument about whether it did or it didn't. But my sense is, at best, what we're going to get out of the Iran dealing is maybe something that will normalize relations. But if that is what happens, it is plausible, not certain, that that will just strengthen the regime. So it's not going to be an overthrow. It's basically doing some sort of deal which allows Iran and the United States to cohabit, as it were, in the Middle East. Not a bad thing, but not a fundamental transformation. Finally, on Ukraine, I mean, the fundamental issue that you've raised, I think it's pretty clear that any peace deal will involve handling over parts of eastern Ukraine. But this question of guarantees is hugely problematic for two reasons. First, one of the things the Ukrainians are being asked to do as a price of this peace deal is to give up the fortified line, the bastions they have created so staggeringly successfully against the Russian armies. So they are, as I understand it, being asked to retreat and create a whole new set of lines. Whether they will be able to do that as successfully is, I think, a genuine question. And the question of whether there will be credible peace guarantees, as it were, security guarantees, is very open. I think most of us feel that without actual US troops, it won't work. But there's no reason, in my view, to assume that even if the US commits to those troops, and as far as I understand, there's no likelihood of that happening. I mean, the administration is pretty well indicated it doesn't want to do that. But even if it did, will they stay there? Will they stay there in the long run? I think most people in Europe will feel that the deal, therefore, that the Ukrainians are being asked to sign won't guarantee peace. And my own view is that Putin will be back. So I would say I don't really sort of have any vast hostility to what he's been doing this, but I don't think of it as any of it as transformative. And then we've got the Gaza stuff. There's no peace deal here. I don't understand what the arrangement is that which would imagine it. Hamas is not going to be disarmed. This the turning of Gaza into some sort of marine wonderland is not going to happen. You've still got millions of Gazans. Where are they going to go? It's all completely unclear to me. So I have to say, honestly, it looks to me, as I suggested in one of my columns, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. It doesn't amount to a serious peace strategy. But I would love to be wrong.
Want more money, less risk, and a better life? Buy Money Magic, a new book by Lawrence Kotlikoff, Boston University economist, personal finance expert, and best-selling author. Whether it's education, career, marriage, housing, investing, retirement, Social Security, IRA, or 401k decisions, Money Magic delivers scores of secrets to raise your living standard. Financial journalist Jane Bryant Quinn says Money Magic is a must-read. Nobel laureate George Akerlof says Money Magic is quite probably the best financial advice book ever written. Financial guru John Malden says, you'll love this amazing book. It's full of wit, wisdom, and startling paths to a better financial life. And columnist Scott Burns calls Money Magic a funny, brilliant read, offering wildly powerful, unconventional choices that can literally change your life. Get Lawrence Kotlikoff's Money Magic today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers.
I think I proposed a couple of years ago in a column that the U.S. should make, when Trump was talking about making Canada the 51st state, I suggested that he should make Ukraine the 51st state. That may be the only real solution for.
Well, that would be an interesting idea, but it would involve doing something the US has very carefully avoided in its history, which is to make part of the country something that involves a very long-term security commitment. And cleverly, the Americans have avoided that so far.
Yeah. Do you see that some part of what's going on here seems to be just that Trump is nuts at some level, mentally ill. He needs to be in the limelight every 2 seconds, in the middle of the night. He needs to be doing something. He needs to have grabbing all the. But he's also hired all these bumblers, all these morons around him. So it's an administration of cabinet of incompetence. And when you look at when you look at just everything that any of these areas, you see people in charge of getting to this idealized solution that don't seem remotely capable of doing so. And this also extends to what's going on in Minneapolis now. You had people that are bringing in all these troops and not well trained and young kids and geared up to be tough, and then they overreact, and then their handlers show their true incompetence by not bringing them back into line, but by praising them, and things get worse. And this is undermining Trump. I mean, it's like Trump is shooting himself in the foot politically or head politically. But then there's the question, of course, whether we're going to have another free election. He's also toying with interfering there. But I just don't see that he's a competent autocrat. I think he's like a inattentive autocrat, and he's got yes people, but they can't execute.
I don't know. Okay, I understand the argument, and certainly Donald Trump is a very peculiar figure by any standards. But if you are trying to, let's assume for the moment that they're serious, not incompetent. And now, of course, some of the members of the administration are pretty incompetent by standard measures. But some of the people involved in all this, particularly the people in the White House, the people from Heritage and Stephen Miller are not incompetent. My view is they're malevolent, which is something quite different. So look at it in a different way. assume for the moment that the aim is to convert the United States into an autocracy. That is the aim. And the aim at the same time is to turn it into an autocracy whose fundamental ideology is white nationalism. Let's assume that.
No.
And it's very clear that's the ideology of core parts of the MAGA intelligentsia, if we can use that term. Now, from that point of view, I take these people seriously. I mean, I might think they're violent. I disagree with everything that they believe in, but let's take them seriously. Then what would you do? Well, if I look at the range of what they've done, and so I'll go into your thing, but a few others, just look at what's been happening in the media, in what's happening to CBS, to the Post, to slow, steady erosion of independence. The friendly oligarchs are converting these institutions, the Ellisons, Bezos and so forth, into basically mouthpieces for the administration, that, or at least ones that won't oppose it. That's important, cumulatively. They've obviously done extraordinary damage to the civil service, to the competence of it. I follow some of them, these institutions, quite carefully, the intelligence services and so forth, and universities and so forth. You know all this very well. But let's look at your examples. They have established a pretty effective force operating outside the law, without a doubt, not subject to legal constraints, but they are subject to some political constraints, I admit that, in ICE, which is acting freely, has been acting freely in cities in the United States, most recently in Minnesota. And they have killed people. Nobody's going to go to be tried for that. They have indeed made a lot of people in America upset, and that is showing in the opinion polls. That was inevitable. It hasn't stopped them. It hasn't ended it. It could easily move somewhere else very, very quickly. As I said, the operatives in this system of coercion and terror, which, of course it is, seizing people from their cars, disappearing them into what are prisons. Yeah. That's all authoritarian activity. It's designed to frighten people, to intimidate them, to make them less willing to go out. Now, of course, Americans used to being free and secure and are angry about this. Will that matter in the end? Yes, they could step back a bit. The noise calms down, then they'll go on again. With this machine in operation, will it be possible to have fair elections? Donald Trump has already talked about nationalizing in a federal government, federal state, nationalizing the electoral process. Everybody knows what that means. So I would say, if you look at the regimes that have successfully established autocracy, and there are many examples over the last 60, 70, 80 years, the Trump administration is doing really, really well. Objectively, they're making vast progress in the administration in Washington, above all in institutions of law, in some of the most powerful institutions that were autonomous in America. I think they're doing great. And my bet would be, if we're coming here a year or two or three from now, we will look back on it and say they basically succeeded. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think anything that's happened in just the last few days would make me feel any more than, of course, it's going to be a struggle, a huge struggle to convert a great sovereign democratic republic into an autocracy. But if you look objectively at how far they've gone, compared with others who've tried to do this in the recent past and even back in the 20s and 30s, they're doing great. So I give them a lot of credit because the core people around this, Trump himself, of course, is behind all, backs this, but he has a lot of very capable people around him. And the others, well, the people in the administration, if they're troublesome, he can sack them, one or two or three of them. They'll get some others to do the same. That won't be difficult. I think it's very, very important at this stage, from my perception, not to be complacent. They're doing really well.
I guess I tend to try and look on the bright side, but there's no bright side. Not
Well, as I've frequently remarked, and I'm sure I've said this to you, Larry, because it's in the beginning of my book, which is I'm the child of people, particularly my grandfather, my father, who did not look on the bright side, and that's why they are alive and all their family were killed. So I tend to the view that in this sort of situation, you should take people seriously. But there is no great secret here. It's absolutely clear. I give Donald Trump a great deal of credit. He's an honest man. In the fundamentals, he's an honest man. It is absolutely clear what he wants to achieve. In the small details and the big ones, he wants to make Trump. You know, everybody will go hysterical when I say this, but he wants to be the Saddam Hussein of the United States. What do you think these huge building projects of his are telling you? His Trump Kennedy Center. This is absolutely classic megalomaniac dictatorial wish dreams. And he's serious about it, and he's fantastically good at it.
but he's old. He's not going to make it
Oh,
to.
yeah. Now, that's important. That's why he's in a hurry. I think that is true. And there is a genuinely interesting question, profoundly interesting question. What happens to this movement when, as will clearly happen, he will go? And that depends a lot on how much damage there is to the institutions. Remember, you started off with Chavez, or you were talking about Chavez Maduro. Chavez was a genuinely charismatic leader. He was a really first-rate demagogue. And there was a genuine question when he died, what would follow him? Well, but the problem with the genuine charismatic leader is he creates the conditions for somebody like Maduro to follow, a machine dictator, as it were, completely remorseless, characterless, and brutal. Maduro succeeded in creating an unspeakable regime. I'm very glad he's gone, around the gangsters who supported him in the army, the police, all are obvious things. Now, I absolutely agree with you. The next leader of this movement in America, if it isn't removed, can't be Trump. It will be someone else. But it's perfectly obvious if you look at it. There are plenty of people there who could be Maduro. I won't list the names, but one of them, I think, is the vice president. So once you've established the regime, it functions, and you've basically killed off the elections, and that's why the next 3 years are so central. What happens in the next 3 years is so central in this whole story. Once you've killed them, they're killed, and you're in a different state, and getting rid of them, as we see in Iran, as we see in Venezuela, is really, really hard. Now, again, this is not over. I agree with you completely. It's very much at the beginning. But from Trump's point of view, I would say looking at the whole thing, the last year has been spectacularly successful.
So you don't hold much hope for the Supreme Court as a countervailing force.
Now that would be very interesting. Very interesting. I don't have much hope, but one of the most interesting things, and I read a wonderful piece on this. I can't remember who it was by, but we may have discussed it before. The really big case at the moment, very revealing, is the trade case, the tariff case. And I have a lot of friends in America who are deeply knowledgeable on US trade law. And there's a universal consensus among the lawyers, the trade lawyers, that the way Trump has used US trade law and the reasons he's given for using it in the way he has is outside the law. So the Supreme Court should have decided in a fairly straightforward way, Mr. Trump has exceeded his powers and the actions he's taken in important ways are illegal. Now, the interesting question that some of the recent writing I have read has discussed is, okay, if it's so clear, why haven't they decided that? And And why haven't they announced it? Where haven't we got the judgment yet? And we expected a judgment weeks and weeks and weeks ago. And the argument they make essentially is because they're frightened, personally frightened, because if they were to decide, and we will see if that's right or wrong, it's a very big test. It's one of the biggest tests. The judgment that will come from the Supreme Court on this issue is a very big test of the integrity of the Supreme Court. The other branches of the legal system have done very, very well, but it'll all end up in the Supreme Court. So let's take this one case. If they do rule against the president, then they will have split from the people who nominated them and got them into these positions, from their friends and associates, and from the whole MAGA base. And the argument would be that would be professionally and personally very, very damaging for them. And it risks, they risk worse than that because of the potential for violence. And it will take a great deal of courage for the Supreme Court, the majority, to rule against Trump. So let's see what happens. But that will be the hypothesis I've read, which seems to me plausible, about why it's taking so long for them to make a ruling. I don't count myself as an expert here, but it's absolutely clear to me that nothing in US law allows him to impose 50% tariffs on Brazil because they're prosecuting a former president over trying to seize an election. And that being so, it's a pretty straightforward case. The Supreme Court just has to say that isn't part of the law, because it isn't. Anyway, so that's my ruling of this. And the next few months, maybe even sooner, will tell us a lot about whether the Supreme Court is a functional defense of the Constitution. To me, the most encouraging thing is exactly what you just talked about, which is the public reaction to the ISIS behavior in Minnesota. The polls that I've been reading indicate a vast majority of Americans are shocked and horrified. And I don't expect much from the elites. In fact, I've never expected much from any of the elite institutions or bodies when faced with the concerted power of the US federal government. But it's very difficult to keep quiet the views of most Americans. And maybe it's the decency of ordinary Americans, the recognition that there are some things we don't want. We don't want stormtroopers wandering across our country, because that's what they are. And that might be the saving. So I don't look actually really to the Supreme Court. I look to the decency and integrity of ordinary Americans who recognize that their peace, their security, their being Americans is at stake.
Yeah. Well, I think organizing the takeover of our elections, since they're run by the states, would be a big deal. You'd have to.
Well, that will be the most dramatic statement that America has become a dictatorship you can possibly imagine. And I hope and pray and expect that he will fail. But those are clearly, we're now getting to really big moments. But what's shocking to me is that he even announced it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just mechanically doing this would require some plan, and the states, I don't know. That could be if, for example, he sent in ICE or whatever to grab the ballots in Los Angeles. I would imagine he would be facing this. We might have a civil war breakout.
I've never believed in the Civil War model because it's very difficult for the states to rival the strength of the federal government. A crucial issue, obviously, you know this better than I do, and it's clearly a central issue now and not resolved, is what role the armed forces, the army, would play. And I have heard some stories, and I'm sure that there are mutterings in the army, despite the fact they've decapitated in the armed forces, they've decapitated it, with taken lots of leaders away, replaced them with their people. And that was true, I was told, over Greenland. That one of the things that happened is very senior people in the armed forces say we're not going to start a war with NATO allies. I don't know whether it's true, but that's what I've read. No, clearly, you're absolutely right. They clearly couldn't do what you describe, I suspect, even just with ICE, though ICE is getting much bigger. The crucial question, if you want to take over the elections, would you be able to use the armed forces to take over crucial capitals? I pray that you're right, and it's impossible. That's going to be one of the things. But the game plan for an autocratic takeover is quite well known. And Erdogan did it best, but much more slowly. And we're moving through in the US very quickly through this, and we'll see what happens. I pray you're right.
How financially secure do you feel? Imagine a tool to help you make smart financial decisions. A tool that factors in all your financial data and shows what you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life. That tool is Maxify. Powerful, accurate, and easy to use. Developed by Boston University economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, Maxify takes the guesswork out of financial decisions at every stage of life. Maxify calculates what you can afford to spend now and throughout retirement. And you can run what-if scenarios to see how your finances might change by taking a new job, buying a home, or downsizing. Knowing the impact before you decide lets you make smarter decisions so you can finally enjoy financial peace of mind. Are you ready? Visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I. Maxify. Maxify.com.
Well, let's turn back to Europe. And, Trump has eliminated military aid to Ukraine almost 100% compared to Biden. I think he's producing some stuff that he's selling to the Europeans to give the Ukrainians, but that's just maintaining our our defense industry. So basically, NATO doesn't exist as effectively at the margin from what it appears. And Russia could decide, well, we're not making progress here. There's these fortifications, but we could run into invade the Balkans, the Baltics pretty quickly and easily. Do you see war breaking out in Europe? And do you see the EU and the UK able to defend itself against Russia at this point?
The answer, that's a complicated question. I'm certainly not an expert, but so I stress that very, very strongly. And there's some very interesting questions here, but if it's a conventional war, there is weaponry that the Europeans would clearly need and material from the US, because our armed forces are in general not, to put it mildly, self-sufficient. That was part of the NATO structure because it was efficient for the US to develop certain parts of the technologically complex and sophisticated armaments industry, broadly defined, and all the major countries are to a significant extent dependent upon it. I think it would be very, very difficult to maintain NATO troops as they are without the willingness of America to supply at least arms. At the same time, that's downside. And I stress my ignorance here is colossal. It's ridiculous for anyone to think that I can say anything useful. But at the same time, it's pretty obvious that if you look at it as a conventional force, the Russian army is a disaster. The general perception in the beginning of this war was that Russia had the capacity essentially to roll over Ukraine very, very quickly. And the reality is not only that they failed to do that, the Ukrainians were able to push them back fairly quickly, and then it essentially stabilized. And they have lost, as I understand it, again, these are just figures I read, over 1 million men on casualties from this war, which is an enormous number. And they're not making any progress. They've lost the Black Sea. So the Russian armed forces don't look very impressive. Yeah, they can blow out the electricity and so forth, but they haven't made any progress. So it's not clear to me that the Russians would necessarily be very successful in the attack. Yes, obviously the Baltic states will be difficult to defend. I understand that, but Poland is very highly armed and very aware of what we're involved, and they would certainly fight like hell. So the Germans are rearming pretty quickly. So in a conventional war, even if the Americans are not very helpful, would they really roll over the Europeans? I strongly suspect not. Look, given what we're seeing right now in Ukraine. So that raises then the question, would Putin dare to use tactical nuclear weapons? And would that be a red line which the Americans couldn't ignore? Or would the Americans say, well, the Europeans have been ungrateful allies, and if that happens, so be it? And that would be a stage at which the Europeans would probably have to surrender because they don't have, well, there are the French and British nuclear deterrents. The British nuclear deterrent is dependent on America. And if the French use it, they do really have the risk of being incinerated. So there are huge questions here about what the West, Europe could do on its own. But Russia will be taking a great risk strategically if it did go for this, because could they be really confident that the Americans would stand aside and watch them if they were to do so, use nuclear weapons against Europe?
And I think it would
But
be
we are clearly not self-sufficient. So if
Yeah.
the Americans just go and the Russians are willing to use nuclear weaponry, it might be very, very difficult. That's all I can see here. And so it will be a disaster.
So we just had the end yesterday of the SALT agreement,
Yes.
and people are starting to talk about smaller countries or countries like Brazil getting nuclear weapons to defend themselves against the U.S. Do you see Germany getting a nuclear weapon, Poland, Finland?
Well, there are other cases, Japan, Korea,
Yeah.
Indonesia, clearly capable. One of the great worries about the end of SALT is that this will lead to an explosive increase in nuclear weaponry across the world. And that was what the whole nuclear disarmament process, or nuclear, not disarmament, but managing, going back to the 70s, was designed to prevent. So my hypothesis would be if we have a very large increase in the number of nuclear weapon states, the chances that they will be used and we will end up in some form of nuclear war must be increased very significantly. However, what else could be the case? So I think it would be a terrible mistake. It is a terrible mistake. I've read a very powerful piece very recently about the consequences of this. I think it's one of the great achievements of the 60s and 70s, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was to contain these risks. And I think it's incredibly irresponsible that we are allowing this achievement just to expire in the way we are. But the way it will then unfold, I don't know. Now, coming back to your question about, I think Germany, I don't know. To me, the more plausible and more sensible step would be for, in this situation, for Europe to increase its strengths together and to turn the French force de frappe into a European nuclear force to which other states contribute resources and technology over time. Whether Germany will get a nuclear weapon on its own, I think that must be very questionable. I'm not at all sure the Germans are really up for it. May happen. The same applies to Japan. Because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they are very reluctant to go in this direction too. But clearly there's a risk.
Yeah. In the meantime, we seem to have some realignment economically, globally occurring. U.S., just tourism to the U.S. has dropped, I think, 15% from Europe. I think it's 30% from Canada, about 6% overall. We've got this EU-Indian free trade agreement, which we've got. So I'm sure got these big tariffs that the U.S. has put up against certain, still 50% against Brazil, maybe there's been some reduction there. I think there has been actually
Yeah, a bit.
a
And there's
bit.
been a big reduction between the US and India.
Yeah. So it's now not 50%, but down to 25% because they're not importing Russian oil, which is a good sign that there's that Trump is trying to pressure Putin as well. So give him some credit on that. But uh, China's economy, even though it's not growing as rapidly, is still growing 5%. The US grew 3% last year, UK 1%, EU 1%, Germany 0%. What do you make of the geoeconomic scene here? Do you think US is going to become completely isolated, mining coal, eliminating clean energy, having eliminating electric cars effectively, going back to the horse and buggy, kind of as a metaphor. And China, meanwhile, I think they added more electric. I think something like 40% of the U.S. electric power was added in China this last year.
That's what I read. Yes.
Amazing number.
Question: how financially secure do you feel? Do you have enough money to retire? How much is enough? And if you don't have enough, how can you possibly find that money before you retire? Tough questions. One smart answer: Maxify. Maxify is the powerful online planning tool that takes the guesswork out of retirement. Maxify compares your assets against your fixed expenses to calculate how much you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life. And it shows you safe ways to find more money. Developed by Boston University economist Lawrence Kotlikoff, Maxify makes a complicated problem like retirement planning simple. Maxify. Powerful, accurate, easy to use. Want some peace of mind? Make the smart choice. Maxify. Visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I. Maxify. Maxify.com.
So they're just going crazy. And I think they can become so the projections I've done in a study called the Future of Global Economic Power, which came out in the Oxford Economic Policy Review just recently with some colleagues, including Russian colleagues, shows that under reasonable conservative growth assumptions, even given the demographics, China will end up with about 25% of the world GDP at the end of the century. India maybe 11%, 10%. The US would be about 11%. Europe would be about 8, 9%. Real realignment here. And that's kind of inevitable, even though China's fertility rate is 1, and their population is projected to fall by more than 50% by the end of the century. So we got some very interesting things going on. But meanwhile, China's this powerhouse in terms of being able to grow and not consume and just keep investing and investing. And we have the ability to really, as a world, to take advantage of that and enjoy cheap products produced by Chinese people that are willing to live on very little. And nobody wants to, we're turning our back to that to preserve kind of failed industries that are no longer have a comparative advantage. You could say, well, it's unfair that the Chinese are subsidizing production, but they are, and it looks like they're going to continue. So maybe that's just that's the world we're living. That's the comparative advantage we're facing that they've got compared to us, and we should take advantage of it, not try and fight it to protect 7% of our workers are in manufacturing, down from 30% in the 50s. And we think, and it hasn't turned around under Trump, at least in the first year. So it seems like the U.S. is isolating itself and also internally shooting itself in the head by going backwards and also restricting immigrants. I think we're down about 1 million legal immigrants coming into the U.S. We've restricted over the last year compared to the year before. Is this a path to autark? I mean, is this a path to, an autocrat? Why does an autocratic regime have to be so stupid economically? Is there any connection between trying to become autocratic and also an autarky. Any
Well, historically, it has tended to be related, though not completely, because autocrats have tended to be control freaks. And if you're a control freak, usually, not always, there are exceptions, you want to control the key parts of the economy. And if your economy is deeply entwined with the rest of the world and deeply dependent on the rest of the world as a result, which is inevitable, autocrats usually don't like it. Now, so that was the most striking example of that, of course, was the policies of Stalin, but also of Hitler during the 30s and 40s. They were self-sufficiency freaks. In fact, Hitler's motivation for the war on the East, which was the core of the war, was what he called Lebensraum, which was basically about land for the people and the resources. He wanted the resources of Russia. So this is sort of a familiar theme in a way. But there's another aspect of it which you touched on, of the politics, before we get to the really big question. From the American point of view, clearly for Donald Trump, a very important part of his base were actual and past forcibly retired industrial workers who wanted, as it were, their jobs back. He promised to reindustrialize America. That was part of the deal. And the way he sold the tariffs to the US was that it would eliminate the external deficit and it would reindustrialize America. That's part of the political deal. So for these two reasons about a degree of autarky and this reindustrialization theme then fits in with that, and it fits in, of course, with this promise to his important part of his base that he would give them their jobs back. Now, I'll just make the following comments. I've argued throughout, and I think we've agreed, that the Trump program, viewed as an economist, is incoherent because tariffs on their own will certainly not eliminate the huge external deficits, which are a macroeconomic phenomenon. And all the work that has been done by serious economists like Bob Lawrence in Harvard and so forth on this have indicated that at the most, maybe 3 percentage points you could increase the share of the labor force in the United States working in manufacturing by about 3%, and only half of that will be shop floor workers. A lot of them will be people basically in the service, managerial and service sectors. So the idea that this will transform the prospects for industrial workers just doesn't fit the numbers. And if you want to eliminate the current account deficit, you have to massively increase production relative to income or spending. And you can't do that when you're running a huge fiscal deficit. And there isn't the slightest sign that he wants to do anything about that. We haven't discussed the new Fed chair, but that all fits in with that. So they have no indication that they want to do that. So the macroeconomic and trade policies of the US are, I think, certain to fail in the terms that they put.
But you're saying
let me just deal very quickly with the other part of it. Yeah, I agree with your description. America's done very, very well in terms of sustaining growth. It's done it remarkably well. But a lot of the reason that its share of world GDP has remained so strong is the exchange rate has gone up so much. And that's not likely, I think, to last. In the long run, if you look at the world, it is plausible, not certain, that the share of real GDP of India and China and other big East Asian countries is going to rise. That of Europe is clearly going to fall. And I don't see anything that will indicate the US will rise dramatically. Then you get down to the core of this, the tech war. The US has basically handed the whole clean energy technology sphere to China. I think that's a very big thing for the Chinese to dominate, because I think it's going to be an important part of the energy picture, even if you don't accept climate change in the future. That's a big mistake. And the Chinese are doing phenomenally well in the tech sector. I mean, much better with AI than most people imagine. And now Mr. Trump has agreed even to give them NVIDIA chips. So it doesn't look like that doesn't look like a very credible war either. So I would say your description of where the world is heading, forecasting over 20, 75 years is very heroic, but it seems completely plausible to me. I don't see how the West, whose population is far smaller than China's alone, and will also shrink, and certainly Europe's is going to shrink, is going to continue to be maintain even its current position in the world, given what's going on, particularly in Asia.
So the future is in our country, all these promises made, and I mean, I think maybe Trump's daydream would be, or the MAGA's, the people in his circle, it doesn't matter. We promised, we lied,
Yeah,
and we're going to take
in
over
essence.
the elections, and we're going to keep power for
Yeah.
ourselves and become as wealthy as possible, and die with the most toys, and screw everybody else in the country and the world. And if we don't grow, too bad. It's
That is not inconsistent with the evidence and um, of what they want, whether they were allowed to get away with it. That's a very interesting question. But if you look at Scott Bessent, who's obviously a very smart guy, as far as I can see, his only strategy is to manage the debt they're accumulating. And this is the manage the Fed, make sure it's supportive and credible and understands that somehow or other the debt situation must be managed. And I think with Kevin Walsh, they've probably chosen the right guy.
yeah. This brings us to the last 2 minutes here question, which is we have a entirely unsustainable fiscal policy. It's not just the official debt being
Of course.
years GDP. Social Security's unfunded liability is 2 years of GDP. We got Medicare, Medicaid,
Of
18%
course.
GDP
You've
growing.
written about that very convincingly.
So the country's going broke. Countries that go broke and don't raise taxes or cut spending, which is what we're doing, make money to make money.
Of
And
course.
and lowering interest rate is just a story for printing money. It just goes hand in hand. That's the way you lower interest rates. You buy up bonds and push out money. So do you see the U.S. hyperinflating or inflating or
I don't
falling
see
apart?
the optimistic view, which doesn't seem to me utterly ridiculous, but you can judge it probably better than me, which clearly Walsh says he believes in, is that AI is going to transform potential growth. And let's assume that potential growth is actually going to be increased by 3 percentage points. Let's assume that. Well, that clearly makes it look very, very, very much better. If you believe that, so the non-inflationary growth rate of the US goes to 5%, 5 or 6%, because of AI. This is a once in a century transformation of potential output. And if you've got 5% growth, I'm pushing let's suppose you're really optimistic of 5 or 6, then this all starts looking much nicer as long as you contain your spending promises. There are wrinkles there. But unless you believe in that sort of miracle, and I'm not going to rule it out because I don't know enough about AI, then you have to believe what you're saying is true and it will end in tears. At some point, they're going to print money like crazy, inflation will soar, everybody in the world will dump dollars, and my God, there are huge creditor holdings out there. The deficits will have to be crashed through the hyperinflation. The inflation tax goes mad, and we're in a completely different world. And surely intelligent people around the world who hold money looking at this will say, do I want to be long US dollar bonds at current interest rates? It doesn't look very good protection to me. Let's get into something else. And I think that is the great danger. And in this respect, Trump will not be the first dictatorial figure who's destroyed his economy by inflation, and that is, I think, a very, very real danger, unless you believe this colossal upsurge in growth story, which some people clearly in America do believe.
Yeah, I don't believe it. I mean, I just think it's one mathematical computational system, but we have lots of others, and this one can't do that. It's got the wrong math to do answer lots of problems. It
Well,
can be.
I think you're certainly far more expertise than I have. Haven't read any credible economist, in my view, who shares that view, but it is out there. And if that isn't true, in the end, the internet did raise the growth rate of the US by a percentage point or so, maybe for a while, and then it stopped again. That seems to me a more plausible hypothesis given the history of economic growth. Well, in that case, yeah, I don't see how the fiscal position works out without some pretty radical tax and spending measures at some point.
I'll just leave us with this depressing fact. Argentina had 85% of our per capita GDP a century ago. Today it's
Yes.
15%. We've had all this technological change, nuclear, the internet, nuclear energy, you name it, over this course of a century. And they didn't change their fiscal policy. And our fiscal policy, our spending is very much tied to real income. So even if AI were spectacularly successful in raising GDP, at least temporarily, defense spending would go up as the same share. Everything would rise as the same share unless we change our spending behavior, as you said. But anyway, thank you so much. This has been fantastic yet again, and we will be back in touch shortly.
I would stress again, I hope I'm wrong, but I am now pretty worried.
Me too. Okay.
But it was wonderful to talk to you, Larry, as it always is.
Same here.